Very much. Our next speaker is Robert Frost, who holds the Barnett Fletcher Chair of History at the University of Aberdeen. He was educated at St Andrews University, the Jagiellonian University, and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University of London. His main interests lie in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His first book was published in 1993 and was entitled After the Deluge, Poland, Lithuania, and the Second Northern War. And his latest book has just been published. It's the first part of a 2-volume Oxford history of Poland, Lithuania. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll get this out for you. Thank you very much. I should begin with the T-shirt. Has the camera got there? The significance of the T-shirt has just been well explained by Łukasz, so I don't need to go on about it. But I should explain the circumstances in which I came by it. I was invited to speak in Horodło in early October 2013 to mark the 600th anniversary of the Union of Horodło. And I was given this T-shirt because the Museum of the History of Poland, note the History of Poland, mounted an excellent exhibition during that conference in Zamość and then in Horodło, at which this was one of the prize exhibits, and they produced a T-shirt with it upon it. And I acquired one. Now, the exhibition talked and discussed, and one of the features of the exhibition was exhibits on the occasion on the 10th of October 1861, when a procession of 8,000 wished to march to commemorate to Horodło the 448th anniversary of the Union of Horodło, led by Greek Catholic and Roman Catholic priests singing religious and patriotic songs. It advanced towards Horodło and was stopped by the Russian army, who had no intention of letting it into Horodło. So they sat down and they had a service in a little cemetery, and that's where the Kopiec w Horodle is to this day. Now, in some ways, that was a peculiar choice to spread the word about this, the supposed Rzeczpospolita Trojga Narodów instead of the two peoples. Now, Łukasz has pointed out that already in the 19th century, the Poles, or some Poles, had begun to work out that the way in which the Ruthenians had been treated in the Polish-Lithuanian Union had caused problems. Now, the Poles had much reason to consider what had gone wrong with the great state that they venerated, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had disappeared, the only major European state to disappear in modern times, just as the French Revolution was declaring that the nation one and indivisible was sovereign and that the nation state was going to rule the future. And some came to the conclusion that the way they had treated the Ruthenians was one of the problems. Wouldn't it have been fabulous if the Union of Hadziach had worked? But we thought about it too late. Now, Horodło, as I say, is an odd choice to pick to celebrate the Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, because the purpose of the Treaty of Horodło in 1413 was to cement the Polish-Lithuanian Union, and although Horodło is on the River Buch, in what Khrushchev would certainly have claimed as Ukrainian national territory, the great Ruthenian lords were not invited to the Horodło meeting, and the Ruthenians were excluded from it, unlike the Treaty of Krewo, the Act of Krewo in 1385, when Jogaila Jagiełło famously promises to join, if that is the correct translation of applicare, his Lithuanian and Ruthenian realms to the Kingdom of Poland in some unspecified way, which was going to cause a lot of problems. Horodło, the Ruthenians are not there. The great Ruthenian lords do not swear loyalty to the Union. So I've been writing the last 4 years this book, which looks to challenge ideas of the Union and to explain the dynamics of the Union in a way in which we can understand why it lasted for so long. And in many respects, the way the history of the Union is written about at the moment do not explain that and cannot explain that because they're written from the perspective of the national states that have succeeded it, the successor states, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. The three last mentioned have very ambivalent ideas about the Union. It was a disaster. It held us back. It was terrible. And today, there is an idea which is propagated enthusiastically by Russian historiography that the Union was nothing more or less than a Polish empire in which Polish culture and the Polish political system was extended over large swathes of Eastern Europe. The Russians like this because it suggests that what's going on in Eastern Europe is a contest between Poland and Russia for the lands in between. And it can be subsumed in the simple idea of imperialist history and colonial history. If you go around the websites from Russia that comment on the Giedroyc doctrine, this is what they will say and will uphold, that the Giedroyc doctrine is just a new version of the Polish idea of empire, the Polish civilizing mission. Now, in many respects, the Poles have only themselves to blame for this conception, because the way that they talk about the Union themselves is, in many respects, open to this sort of interpretation, that idea of the Jagiellonian idea, the civilizing mission of what was a Catholic society. They deserve that reputation. But I argue in my book that you cannot understand the Union unless you understand that this was not an empire. It was, and here the Poles are right, it was a consensual system that was entered into by agreement, not by conquest. And I argue that the Lithuanians and the Ruthenians played as large a part in the construction of that union as the Poles. The Union of Lublin was only possible because of the engagements of Lithuanians and ultimately the Ruthenians in what was a great idea. An idea which we should not label Polish particularly, because it was an idea that grew out of Western Catholic civilization and the Catholic political thought of that era. The idea of what Susan Reynolds calls a communitas regni, a community of the realm, which limits the power of the crown. Now, you will see in all the textbooks that the Polish-Lithuanian Union between 1385 and 1569 was a purely personal union, or a dynastic union at the periods where Vytautas was Grand Duke of Lithuania and Jagiełło was King of Poland, or in the 1490s after the death of Kazimierz Jagiellończyk. Poland and Lithuania were only tied by slight dynastic links. You cannot understand the union if you think in those terms. Personal unions were common across Europe at this point, and they were personal unions. Poland entered into a few of them, two with Hungary, one with the Kingdom of Bohemia, later on with Sweden and with Saxony. These were unions in which they were deliberately kept, the states, the realms were deliberately kept separate. This was never the case in the Polish-Lithuanian Union. The intention from the start was that it should be a union of communities and peoples, as much as of realms. That is clear in the Krewo Act, to which the communitas regni in Poland, okay, it was spoken for by a few Małopolskan lords, largely. But it was the community of the realm that was a party to this treaty. Horodło was a treaty between, for the first time, the Polish community of the realm and a Lithuanian community of the realm, the 47 families that were adopted into Polish coats of arms, or heraldic clans, by the order of Vytautas. Now, you will see lots of interpretations written by Lithuanian historians, and indeed Polish historians, that talk about Vytautas as a separatist, a Lithuanian separatist who wants to defend Lithuanian sovereignty and independence. And they apply ideas of sovereignty and nation statehood that you can only talk about after Jean Baudin in the 16th century, and the Treaty of Westphalia, which created the modern idea of state systems. People in 1413 had a conception of the realm. They certainly had that. They had conceptions, however, of lordship, of suzerainty, and these were far more important in 1413. But Horodło, now, currently in Lithuania, there's a sort of sense of nostalgia, I can see in popular history certainly, for the Lithuanian period, what Khrushchev called the Lithuanian period, from Krevo to 1569. I'm currently writing for Frank the introduction to volume 4 of the translation. And I get the sense that this is the bit of the great history that Khrushchev, he's got to fill it in. It's his pot boiler. He's got to get from the great days of Kievan Rus to the bit he really wants to write about, which is the Cossacks and the emergence of modern Ukrainian nationhood. And he's stuck with this bit in the middle where the Lud don't do anything. And he's got to write about the politics of the Grand Duchy, which he doesn't approve of at all, of course. Well, he sort of approves of the Lithuanian bit. It's a union he doesn't approve of. And there's some nostalgia in popular Ukrainian thought for the Lithuanians, and not so bad as the Poles, the nasty Poles who oppressed us after 1569. Except that the whole point of the Union of Horodło is to exclude the Ruthenians. In many respects, the Lithuanians enter into a union with Poland because if they don't do it at the end of the 14th century, they're going to disappear. The official language is Ruthenian. Jogaila comes from the Ruthenian part. His mother is Ruthenian. The court that he maintains in Poland is Ruthenian speaking. He's Ruski in all sorts of ways, but he's also Lithuanian. The only way that the Lithuanians can keep some sort of separate identity is by joining with Poland, and Horodło is designed to do that. The Polish system of government, the województwa, are given only to Lithuania propria, not to Żmudź, interestingly, not to Samogitia, but just to the Palatinates of Trakai and Vilnius. So, the Lithuanians are not so tender with regard to the Ruthenians, but where does Ruthenia fit into this? Well, this is not a unitary modern state that the Lithuanians establish. The Grand Duchy works, as Khrushchev points out, because it leaves much of the southern Ruthenian lands alone. This is a composite state. Ruthenian law, the Prava Ruskaya, runs there. They're left pretty much to govern themselves. Vytautas will interfere a bit in who he wants to get rid of all those nasty Gedaminid princes. He's not so concerned about the the Ruthenian princes, the great families of Ruthenia. He's interested in the ones that have a dynastic claim that could stop him and any children he has of inheriting the Grand Duchy. He wants the union. He needs the union. And the Lithuanians need the union and want the union because Horodło is the treaty on which their political liberties are based. And they never forget that. So the idea that Horodło lapses in some way is utterly false. They remember it when it's convenient to them in the centuries that follow. But what about the Ruthenians? Well, the Ruthenians want to be part of this great image of a citizen system. So when Vytautas dies in 1430, it's quite clear that Jagiełło does not want his youngest, rather unreliable brother, Świdrigaila, to become Grand Duke and replace Vytautas, although Horodło has allowed for the election of a Grand Duke on Vytautas' death. Jogaila says, nah, this guy's flaky, I'm not doing it. And the Lithuanians and Ruthenians say no. And in the 1430s, the Ruthenian great lords force their way into the system. They want part of this citizen democracy. And then there is a sort of beauty contest between Jagiełło and Świdrigaila, well, Žygimantas, Vytautas' brother, who gives the privileges that the Lithuanians have got in 1413 to the Ruthenians. Jogaila actually wants to give them to the Ruthenians in the Polish kingdom first, which would give the southern Ruthenian Palatinates some idea that they were part of this kingdom and that being with Poland rather than Lithuania would be good for them. And at every point thereafter, the Ruthenians are involved, and you do get the emergence. Once they are granted rights, but in 1434, not full rights, not political rights in certain offices. The offices that Horodwo limits to Lithuanians, or Catholics, it's not Lithuanians, it's Catholics, are the central offices of state. And it's that small Lithuanian clique that begins to run Lithuanian politics. All of them are members of the Horodwo 47 families, but only a handful of them, in fact. And after Kazimierz Jagiellończyk becomes King of Poland in 1447, on his own terms, the union is not broken in 1440, I would argue. The Lithuanians, remember, they want Kazimierz to be their Grand Duke, not their governor. He's sent to Vilnius to be a governor. And they beg with the Poles. They say, Horodwo allows us to elect a Grand Duke. And the Poles say, no, can't possibly. We haven't got the instructions for that. He's going to be a governor. So the Lithuanians give up and say, okay, Horodwo says you should consult. You haven't consulted. So they get up in the morning and elect Kazimierz Grand Duke. Throughout his long reign, he decides not to have the Vytautan system and a separate Grand Duke. And that means Lithuania is run by this small clique of Lithuanian families, which is fine, because they leave, essentially, Kazimierz leaves the Ruthenian Palatinates alone. But in the 16th century, this begins to break down and becomes more problematic because of the Muscovite Wars. Now, most of the Ruthenians, the majority of the Ruthenians, despite the work of Oswald Bacchus, decide that they don't want to be part of the great Muscovite Empire. They'd far rather have the citizen rights that they have. They are second-class citizens, and Lithuanian clique that rule make that quite clear when Sigismund the Old nominates Konstantin Ostrowski as Palatine of Trakai in 1522. There's a huge fuss, and Albertus Goštautas stands up and says, what about the Treaty of Horodwo? This is illegal. You can't do this. Here are our rights maintained. He's remembering the Treaty of Horodwo then. But the final drama, the Union of Lublin, would not have taken place without the Ruthenians. The most important man at the Lublin Parliament is Konstantin Vasil Ostrowski. Because when the great Lithuanian lords stamp out in March 1569, because they're bankrupt, they can't afford not to have the union because they can't beat the Russians on their own, 70% of Polish taxes in the 1560s go to pay for troops to fight the Russians in Lithuania. So the Poles have some reason for wanting to have a closer union so they can control Lithuania. The Lithuanians have declared war. The Poles have paid for it. So we better control that. But when it comes down to it, what does Ostrowski do? He doesn't go with the Lithuanian lords to Vilnius. He goes to Tarnów, which is where he's involved in a dispute about the ownership of the city because he's married to Zofia Tarnowska. And he sits there. And when the crunch comes, the Ruthenians are left suspended. What do the princes think? And he decides, we go for union with Poland. Like his father, he realized he's been cooperating with the Poles in defending the southern frontiers against the Tatars. A union with the Kingdom of Poland would unite the southern Ruthenian Palatinates. And so they negotiate a union of equals. Now, the argument about the union between the Lithuanians and the Poles has not been about whether to have a union. It's what the union means, what these damn union treaties mean. The Poles say, you're incorporated. You are part of Poland. So it doesn't matter, Volhynia is ours, it's yours, we're all part of the same state. The Lithuanians say, no, we are a union of equals. We must preserve our separate individual offices, our titles, our identity as a realm. Now that deadlock goes on from 1413 down to 1569, and it's the Ruthenians who break it. When the crisis comes, Ostrowski decides, okay, Podolia, Volhynia are being annexed to the crown. Well, we'll ask the nobility whether they want to be. And the nobles say, yes, the Lithuanians haven't offered us enough. We're second-class citizens. It's the king who has given us full political rights in 1563, not that small clique in Vilnius. And they negotiate a union of equals. And it is once they've done that, for Podolia and Volhynia, then the Ruthenians become the most radical. They sit alongside the Krakow radicals and say, incorporate the whole of the rest of the kingdom, of the Grand Duchy. And it is they who push for Kiev and Bratslav to be incorporated as well. The Poles have said, well, wait a minute. A document is drawn up by the Polish Chancellery that says we could take Kiev, and the Vice-Chancellor writes in the margin, not necessary, because he's worked out we'll have to defend it if we take it, and I don't necessarily want that, but the Ruthenians want Ruthenia united. And it is. And the Lithuanians they protest, but they haven't got a leg to stand on. Now, clearly, the process that I have gone through 500 pages in 15 minutes or so, 2 minutes left, that's good, that's all I need, is vitally important for developments that followed and what we've been hearing about since, for the sense of Ukraine, of Ruthenia, of Rus, as separate from Lithuanians and Poles. The ideal of the Commonwealth was what appealed. Its realization was something else, and I won't go there now. But I would just like to end by encouraging historians of Ukraine, historians of Lithuania, historians of Belarus, not to leave the history of this process to Poles. This is utterly constitutive of the modern sense of nationhood, of identity, of what has since happened. And yet, and those of you who were in Harvard 2 years ago will have heard me say this already, if you look at the Ukrainian Journal of History, Historyczny Journal, the Lithuanian period takes up 18% of the years in Ukraine's history since 860, 4% of the articles. There's virtually nobody working on this. This is Polish history, it's Lithuanian history, it's not our history, it is your history. And don't just write the history of Ukraine. That was necessary when Khrushchev does it. Nobody is, well, there are some people perhaps to the east who question the statehood and separate nationhood of Ukraine. But in the light of the current crisis, very few elsewhere are doing that. Ukraine is painfully emerging as and coping with some of the problems it has to cope with if it is going to take its place as it should among the modern nation states. But what Khrushchev did was necessary at the end of the 19th century, but we need to escape his shadow and look at the Polish-Lithuanian Union in a different way and reclaim the Ruthenian and Lithuanian parts of that history and stop obsessing about projecting the nation state backwards into places it shouldn't go. Thank you.